Good afternoon and welcome to the Six Bridges Book Festival. I'm Susan Moneyhon and I can't believe this is my 11th year to be doing this book festival. It's one of my favorite things I've ever done. Today we are talking to Dr. Ross King, author of The Bookseller of Florence, the story of manuscripts that illuminated the Renaissance. Before we get going though, just a little housekeeping. If you have questions, please put them in the question and answer section rather than the chat, because there's a lot to talk about in this book, and we want to wait to compile and curate the questions until the end of the discussion. So that would be very helpful. Dr. King, your book is a breathtaking glimpse of some 70 odd years in the middle of the 15th century, using this master bookseller manuscript preparer as the linchpin to hold and connect a massive amount of history together. One reviewer wrote, and I agree with this person wholeheartedly, Vespasiano is less the subject of the book than he is the method. So I'd like to welcome you and let's get started.
Thank you, Susan. Yes, Vespasiano is my guy for this, and he is the character, the real life character through which I give, as you say, some 70 years of Florentine history specifically, but also more generally of the history of Italy and the history of Europe during the 15th century. So Vespasiano begins work in the early 1430s when the Medici when Cosimo de' Medici comes back to power, and he dies in 1498, right at the end of the century, as under Savonarola, things are changing in Florence and Europe is changing. So he covers what Vespasiano himself called the golden age of Florence, this wonderful period of artistic creativity, and also, as I stress repeatedly in the book, of intellectual endeavor and intellectual questioning and adventurism, because that was the sort of raft on which Vespasiano was floating into these worlds, these which had been lost, these sort of islands of knowledge had been lost for the better part of 1,000 years. And Vespasiano was at the forefront of the people who were trying to bring all of this back to Italy, to Florence, where it could be made use of. And I'm talking, of course, about the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans.
Plato, Aristotle,
that's right.
Even some of the lost Roman authors. I love the quote that you started the book with, which is from Vespasiano. All evil is born from ignorance, yet writers have illuminated the world, chasing away the darkness. Well, that's certainly the way I feel about most books. But as he was witness to this golden age, this love of wisdom, he also saw the politics, the assassinations, the wars, the constant looking to be in a crusade, and yet he was doing these incredibly beautiful illuminated manuscripts. Why don't you talk a little about how did he get started? How did he managing this balance act of staying neutral in a time when leaders of Florence demanded complete loyalty?
He held a very important but very precarious position because of the fact that he had this front row seat to history. He was the one who dealt with people like Cosimo de' Medici, but also then with the enemies of Cosimo de' Medici, both within Florence, people like the Pazzi family, and some of you out there probably know about the Pazzi conspiracy and what it entailed. And also Cosimo's enemies outside of Florence and other places like the Pope Sixtus IV, for example, and also the kings of Naples, the various kings of Naples, to whom Vespasiano was very close personally as well as professionally, because he was the manuscript dealer. I guess we haven't really set up who he is in some ways, or I haven't told you who he is. He was a bookshop owner, or he ran a bookshop, which was beside, if you've been to Florence, The bookshop is still there. The building is still there. Regrettably, it doesn't sell books now. It sells pizzas. It's a pizzeria. But he went to work there in 1433 when he was 11 years old. So he was just a boy. He went to work there. He had to go to work there because of the fact that his family basically had no money. He was obviously a very bright boy. And I sometimes wondered about his name, Vespasiano. That's a very, very unusual name. And in fact, I was able to find out in the census records that there was one other Vespasiano in Florence in the 1400s. And of course, he's named for the Emperor Vespasian. And so I sometimes wonder if his parents, thought there was going to be something great about him, or they could do something with him. But the father died when he was only 4 years old. And so and his mother was pregnant with her sixth child at that point. And so Vespasiano had to go and make a living for himself somewhere, which he did in the bookshop. And he very quickly became a central figure, not just in this little bookshop, which is across from the Bargello, the great sculpture museum, which then in his day was the palace of the chief magistrate. He went to work there and very quickly took it over, not only, as I say, took over the bookshop and that sort of cultural milieu in the street of booksellers. That's what that street was known as. It's now the Via del Proconsolo, but back then it was known as the street of booksellers because of all the bookshops along it. And his quickly became the most preeminent, and it became the most preeminent in Europe. And all of these grand people, such as popes like Pope Nicholas V or Cosimo de' Medici in Florence, bishops from France and Hungary, all of these people used him to get manuscripts. And as you say, Susan, this then can put him in an awkward situation because these are, let us say, interesting times. And there's a lot of jockeying for position between and among these people. And some of his best clients were warlords who sort of burnished their reputation. They had reputations for murderous savagery, quite understandably, and they wanted to sort of enhance the reputation for civility and learning through putting together magnificent libraries. And so Vespasiano supplied them, people such as Federico de Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, who was the greatest soldier of the age, but he was also the greatest book collector of the age. And so we have this wonderful situation, or this maybe somewhat strange and counterintuitive situation, where we have these men who were basically soldiers and in many ways, thuggish, unscrupulous, and brutal, who yet nevertheless are the greatest collectors of books, of manuscripts in the 1400s. And Federico was one of those, Cosimo de' Medici was another one, and the kings of Naples, the three men, the father, son, and grandson of Naples, that he dealt with all three, and all three were incredibly bloodthirsty tyrants who were nevertheless, as I say, great collectors of books. So if that made Vespasiano's life a bit difficult, sort of tiptoeing between and among these factions and dealing with very brutal characters, it was an absolute wonderland for me to sort of immerse myself in this really quite dangerous and I think in many ways unfamiliar world. And it just makes for a great story to have Vespasiano dealing with such unscrupulous characters of whom we see another side because of their dealings with him.
It was so interesting to me at the early part of the book. You talk about how the boys of Florence were particularly well educated compared to other countries in Europe. And you say that some 70 or 80% of the boys in Florence went to school. So there must have been something special about Florence in those days to cause people to fall in love with knowledge. Why were they eager to read Aristotle, Plato, the other Greek philosophers? Why were they eager to find the lost manuscripts of Cicero and Lucretius, who is my favorite Roman philosopher?
Yeah, well, if I had that answer, Susan, I'd probably, the book would be number one on the bestseller list, and I would be holding a distinguished professorship at a prestigious university. It's one of those intangible things. Why Florence? I mean, I've been asking myself for 25 years, why Florence? Why did everything happen there between, really after 1300, between 1300 and 1500? And especially in the 1400s, Florence was the capital of the world. The city, which in most of the 1400s had a population of around 40,000. So it's a very small place compared to a city like Milan, which is double that. And Venice is also a larger city at that point with a greater population. And yet it's Florence which leads in architecture and art, the two things that maybe we associate most with Florence. But again, and as I say, I reiterate this in the book, the Florentines were at the vanguard of intellectualism, of learning, of philosophy, of discovering the ancient Greeks and Romans. We owe, for example, to the Florentines the fact that Plato became the backbone of Western culture after 1400. Before 1400, no one read Plato. The Florentines got interested in him in around about 1400, began reading and crucially translating him from Greek, which they taught themselves, from Greek into Latin. And I've wrestled with this question of what it is about Florence that has caused this. And I think in the case of the intellectual activity, a crucial figure possibly is Dante, because I think Dante, who we're in the 700th anniversary of his death this year, so he's quite rightly being celebrated. Dante, I think, is the reason why 8 out of 10 boys went to school in Florence. And in fact, a lot of girls were taught literacy as well. And this is much, much higher, just to put literacy rates in context. And this is one of the things, incidentally, that makes Florence so special, is this high literacy rate that you mentioned. Adult male literacy was probably about 70%, 70 to 80%, because of the fact that they went to school. To put that into context, in Paris, the literacy rate, Paris with its great university at this time, Florence does not have a great university, but the University of Paris, with all of the wealth in the city at that time, Paris had a literacy rate of 25%. And that was probably higher than most cities in Germany, which were probably 10 to 20%. And once you go outside of the cities, into the countryside, into the villages, whether it's Italy, Germany, England, wherever, you're talking about a literacy rate of 1%, 2%, something like that. So in Florence, with this extremely high literacy rate, which no one comes close to matching in the 13 and 1400s, that obviously is something that drives both their commercial success, in some ways their military success, because Vespasiano said at one point that a general who knows Latin and can read the ancient Romans, for example, can read Julius Caesar's works on the Gallic Wars and how he conquered the Gauls. Someone who can do that is going to be a better leader. And that's one of the reasons why these warlords were reading Titus Livius, the great Roman historian, Julius Caesar, and so forth, because they wanted to find the secrets of ancient warfare, for example. And so you get all of this intellectual activity happening because of the high literacy rate. But the question then is, why do they have the high literacy rate? I was hoping, Susan, you would just ask, why Florence? And I could give the literacy rate, but you've actually taken me a step back. Why the high literacy rate? And so that's when I come back to Dante. I think Dante was unprecedented in Western culture as a literary figure who wrote something that was recognized instantly. I mean, even before he was done, it took him some 20 years to write, and he brought out, or he made public, the Inferno and Purgatorio before he came to, before Paradiso was released. And already those first books, by 1315, Dante, before Paradiso was finished, Dante was famous all over Italy. And so I think, and no other culture had an example of that. Dante, of course, was Florentine. He was exiled from Florence, much to his dismay, in the early 1300s. But he was the great Tuscan poet, the great Florentine poet, and a great cottage industry in Florence, in Tuscany, in the 13 and 1400s, was copying out the Divine Comedy, copying out his work for your friends. You might do it as a gift for for someone. And, this is a very sincere gift. I mean, this is the Divine Comedy. I mean, this is how big it was. So it was a great commitment of time to copy it out for someone. But I think the Divine Comedy, in some way, I mean, this is something that's so intangible. I'm just thinking out loud. It's so how it influenced the culture. I mean, it infused the culture very deeply. And I think it was written in the vernacular. It was written in the lingua fiorentina, the language which mutated into Italian that was spoken in Florence at that time. And so there was something about Dante and then Petrarch coming after him, the great lyric poet, that that made it so the Florentines wanted to read and wanted to educate themselves and maybe copy what Dante and Petrarch had done.
Well, why did they take on such interest in what church people would have called pagan authors rather than St. Augustine or Bernard of Clairvaux or some of the other people who were?
Exactly. Very good question. And and I should begin my answer by saying they never lost interest in Bernard of Clairvaux or St. Augustine. In fact, Vespasiano produced a huge 10-volume collection, the most expensive work he ever produced, and probably the biggest was his 10-volume collection of St. Augustine. So there was always interest in the Christian classics, the early Christian writers such as Augustine and Jerome. However, these works were known. I mean, Augustine and Jerome had died, say, around in the 5th century, but their works had never been lost. What the Florentines in particular wanted to rediscover were the works that went behind Augustine. Augustine loved Plato, and his work is infused with Platonism. And in fact, Augustine says in one of his letters that if Plato and Socrates had been alive in the 4th century, they would be Christians, because he saw all sorts of parallels between Christianity and Platonism. And so when when the Florentines read this in the late 1300s, early 1400s, they wanted to read Plato, because if one of their heroes, Augustine, one of the great figures in Christian history, one of the church fathers, if he liked Plato, and he learned from Plato and he used Plato, what could Plato do for them? But also there's a larger thing at issue, which is if you were alive in 1400, 1410, you would have crawled out of the wreckage of what the historian Barbara Tuchman has called the turbulent 14th century. In other words, the 1300s, which were a turbulent time, which I think over the past 18 months, we've learned what turbulence can be like in history. Because of course, in 1348, they had the Black, really 1347 to 49, there was the Black Death in Europe, which killed possibly more than half of the population. But in addition to that, there were things like the 100 Years' War. So warfare went on continuously at that time. And there's all sorts of political violence. The papacy had left Rome and gone to Avignon in the south of France in 1309. And it was absent from Italy for most of the 1300s. And so it really was an ineffective, or at least for the Italians, it had become a tool of powerful Frenchmen. And so Christianity, I think they would have said in the early 1400s, Christianity had somehow failed. Their society had fallen apart. Christianity was concerned above and beyond anything with saving our souls, ensuring the happy fate of our souls in the afterlife. And that was always important to people in the 1400s, because any humanist writer that you choose from that period, or Cosimo de' Medici or Federico da Montefeltro, all of them appear to have been sincere and devout Christians. But what they wanted was something else, because if the Bible was the playbook for your soul, what was the playbook for society? Their society had evolved in a way and kind of devolved into this dreadful state, almost of anarchy. And so what they wanted to do was to go back to the period where they felt there had been a very successful society. in particular Rome. But they also felt that there were lessons to learn from ancient Rome, because Rome had had many years of civil war, really up until the Emperor Augustus ended it when he became emperor in 27 BC. Rome had been convulsed by civil conflict. And so how could, what they wanted to know is, how did the Romans solve their problems, which are not unlike the ones that we're having today?
Right.
So what they really wanted to do was consult the ancients to see what the ancients said about governing a city or waging a war, or even things like being a good friend or being a good husband, or learning how to have fun, things such as this. So that's what they begin looking for. That's why they go off on these wild goose chases to monasteries around Europe, looking for these manuscripts that are going to tell them secrets, the secrets of the ancient Romans, and also ultimately of the ancient Greeks, to help them make a better society.
And one of Vespasiano's friends, Nicolo Nicolai, was a patron, and he, along with Poggio, whose last name I've just forgotten.
Bracciolini.
Thank you. Traveled around Europe and found ancient manuscripts in monasteries. I didn't realize that it wasn't Lucretius, it was
Quintilian.
Quintilian found at St. Gall.
Yes, Quintilian was probably the most sought author. The work they really wanted in Florence was one that sadly they knew existed because they'd seen references to it. It was Cicero, who was the favorite writer of all of them, the great orator and statesman and consul from the Roman Republic. They loved his work. They loved his Latin. He wrote what they felt was the purest Latin, and they imitated him. He wrote a book they knew had existed called On the Republic, and Florence was a republic. And so if Cicero was saying how to govern a republic, this for them was gold dust. They wanted to know what Cicero said about it. Sadly, Cicero's work was not revealed to them. It was a couple of centuries more before that one would be rediscovered. But the other great work they wanted was Quintilian's On the Education of an Orator. And Quintilian was the greatest teacher of rhetoric in imperial Rome. He taught sort of in the late 1st century AD from, probably about 70 to 90 AD, including children of the Emperor Domitian. And so if you have the greatest teacher in Rome, and he's written a book on education, again, this is something that they were salivating over. They were desperate to find it. And so in this sort of heroic and ultimately legendary feat, Poggio Bracciolini goes to St. Gall almost a bit randomly because he happened to be in the area for a council of the church. And he went into the monastery and began looking through the library. At first, he didn't see anything. And then he, according to Poggio, he went into what he calls a dungeon, which seems to have been a kind of tower attached to it, which who knows, maybe it had been used as a dungeon at some point. And he found all sorts of decaying books there. But he discovered ultimately a full and complete copy of Quintilian's On the Education of an Orator. And as I describe in the book, there's really celebration around Italy that he had found this. And people wrote to Poggio saying, you have done a benefit for all mankind, because now we can do what the ancient Romans had done. We can learn, we can sit at the feet of Quintilian, who taught so many of the great Romans.
Well, we have set the stage for what they were interested in reading and why. So would an average Florentine, for example, just walk down the street and go into a bookstore like Barnes and Noble and get a copy off the shelf?
It wasn't that easy. I mean, if you were lucky, that might happen. I mean, Vespasiano just might happen to have a copy of what you wanted. If you wanted, for example, a book on how they had a book which they called a book called the Santa Croce, which was the book that you learned to read by. And it was called that because it had the Holy Cross on the cover of it. You could probably get that in any bookshop because that was what all the school children used. But if you wanted, let's say, a copy of St. Augustine's City of God, chances are you couldn't just go into one of the bookshops and get it. In Florence, perhaps, because the street of booksellers in the 1430s and 40s had 8 booksellers along it. This very, very small, say, 2-block stretch, there were 8 booksellers. So you could go from one to the other, asking around, do you know where I can get a St. Augustine? If all of them said no, what you would then do would be to go to one of them, such as, and most probably to Vespasiano, and say, I want a copy of the City of God. Can you get me one? And Vespasiano would say, I can't get you one, but I know where some are. And what I will do, and the people who own them are not going to relinquish them because they're in institutional settings, perhaps, such as monasteries. But Vespasiano says, I know they're there, and therefore I'll get a copy of it made for you. And so I'll hire a scribe, I'll get the parchment and everything like that, and we will make a special copy just for you. And that's really how many of Vespasiano's commissions came. His clients would approach him either in person, literally coming into his shop, which really was a gathering place for the intelligentsia of Europe. They would either come in person, or they would contact him and say, get me a copy of Pliny's Natural History, or get me a copy of St. Augustine, and so forth. And so it became a kind of, well, as I say in the book, a bookseller really was Barnes and Noble combined with Penguin Random House, combined with a used bookseller, combined with, I suppose, someone who creates publicity and things like that, because I suppose a book manufacturing plant or something like that, because they're actually produced on site. And so Vespasiano was very busy dealing not just with all his elevated clientele, but also with the artisans around Florence, the blacksmiths who would put the chains on the book for him, or create the metal bosses that he decorated the most expensive books with, and so forth. And so it was really, I mean, he had to multitask for each and every book that he made.
And every step in the process was handmade.
That's right. The word manuscript comes from manuscriptus, written by hand. And each of his books was handwritten by a scribe. And in many cases, most cases, in fact, hand decorated by an artist. So you would consult with Vespasiano about that. You would say, I want it copied out. You may even have your favorite scribe that you had used before with Vespasiano. You'd say you want him. And then Vespasiano would say, do you want it decorated? For example, do you want the capital A on page 1 and the capital B at the start of the next chapter? Do you want those illuminated? Do you want me to use gold or silver leaf on them? Do you want some fancy decorations in the margins? Do you want illustrations even? If it was a Bible or something like that, it was often very desirable to have beautiful illustrations telling or showing the stories of the Bible next to the description of it in the biblical verses themselves. And so there were really bespoke items made for a very, obviously, not only a discerning clientele, a literate clientele, but also one that was fairly wealthy, because these books obviously did not come cheaply.
So Vespasiano would have negotiated every single part of a manuscript, from obtaining the exemplar, as you call them, to hiring the scribe, to hiring the illustrators, to the binding process itself, to covering with his favorite red velvet binding. How did he go? I mean, things weren't on paper. Things weren't copyable. Everything had to be done by hand. And he also came up with some innovations. For example, we credit him with the title page.
That's right. I mean, we can thank Vespasiano for the title page, because or at least he's the one who brought it back, because he discovered, because he dealt with so many manuscripts, he found a manuscript that had been produced in Tuscany in the 1200s, and he liked the look of it. He liked the the scribe who'd worked on it, who was using a very different script, obviously, but he liked the script, and he liked the fact that someone had done a decorated title page. I mean, it seems counterintuitive to us now, all these years later, all these centuries later, that books didn't have title pages, but they didn't. All that you had was a kind of running head at the top of the first page, or a heading at the top of the first page, which might have said what it was. A lot of Bibles began with the letter of Saint Jerome at the top, and so you would think you were getting a work of Saint Jerome if you were browsing in a bookstore. But Vespasiano is the one who decided for. The one he first did it for was Giovanni de' Medici, who was the son of Cosimo and a great book collector, as Cosimo himself was. And so Vespasiano decided to make this bespoke item with a page on which it said what it was. It said on the first page that you came to what the book was, what the title was, what the author was, and so forth, and then a table of contents after that. But your mention of the exemplars is interesting, because that's really how Vespasiano outstripped everyone. One of the questions that I had to deal with is, why did he become such a great bookseller? And the reason for it comes, I think, in a letter in 1446, or the explanation comes in this letter from 1446, when Vespasiano was 24, and by which time he'd been maybe 13 years in the bookshop. And this person was in the city of Arezzo in southern Tuscany, writing to a friend in Florence saying, I want to get a copy of Pliny's Natural History. Pliny the Elder's Natural History was one of the great works of ancient Rome. Some of you might know it. I mean, it's full of wonderful and often fantastical details of the natural world that Pliny had made a study of. And it was a very popular book, both in ancient Rome and also through the Middle Ages. And consequently, there were loads and loads of manuscripts of it. There were something like 250 across Europe, which maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but for a manuscript, that was a lot of copies. And so if you say, I want a new copy of Pliny's Natural History, the question becomes, well, which natural history do you want? Do you want the one in Paris? Do you want the one in Rome? Do you want the one in Geneva, etc.? Because each one of these was different. Inevitably, errors, because each one was a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. And so each scribe introduced errors into the book, and so into his manuscript. And so what you had to do as a bookseller like Vespasiano, if you were conscientious, was to find the best copy, the exemplar, and therefore, and have it copied out, and then have it checked for errors afterwards. And this is what Vespasiano excelled in, because what this bishop in Arezzo said in 1446 was he wanted the copy of, the best possible copy of Pliny's Natural History. And he said, our Vespasiano is the best guide for such things. And so Vespasiano, by the time he was 24 years old, was the leading authority in Europe on something like the best copy of the best manuscript of Pliny's Natural History. So Vespasiano would have assembled as many copies as he could get his hands on, which might just have been 2, 3, or 4, who knows? But he would get all of those and check them page by page, really word by word, and see which one agreed with which one was obviously fallacious in some points, and which ones were maybe you could make an edit to and improve based on other readings. And so what he did then was to produce the best, most reliable manuscript of whether it was St. Augustine, Pliny the Elder, or ultimately Plato, because he produced Plato manuscripts as well. And so we have to thank him for sort of passing on knowledge intact in a way that it had not been before then.
He also was a protege of many leading people in Florence, and Nicolo Nicolai was one I was thinking of, because he was friends with Brunelleschi, who was doing the dome on Santa Maria del Fiore, Donatello, the sculptor Ghiberti, who did the doors on the baptistry. It must have been quite heady for a young man to be involved with people like this.
And it was Nicolo who really, I think, introduced him to the world of learning, and the world of learning, first of all, and then the intelligentsia, secondly, because Nicolo had the greatest private collection of manuscripts in Europe. He had, which was 900, or, which maybe doesn't sound like all that much, but because I checked a couple of years ago, and the average primary school in Great Britain is obliged to have 1,200 books in it. Its library has to have 1,200, and the greatest private collection in Europe in the 1400s in the first half of the 1400s, only had 800 or 900 books. Nevertheless, these were quality books. He had books in Greek, books in Latin, all of the Latin and Greek classics that he could get his hands on. And he was called a devourer of books. He was someone who lived for manuscripts. And very quickly, he obviously patronized the bookshop that Vespasiano went to work in, and he recognized Vespasiano's intelligence and took him under his wing. And Vespasiano describes Niccolo's house. He said it was the finest appointed house in Florence. Niccolo was extremely wealthy, not through books. He spent all his money on books, but his father had been a wealthy wool merchant. And so Nicolo invited Vespasiano to what I think we would call today a book club or a book group, where Nicolo would invite all of these young men into his home. They would cross the threshold, and he would put a book in their hands and say, go off and read it. And they would read for an hour or two. And then he'd say, right, everyone close your book and tell me what you've been reading. Tell me something about it. And so we had these little intellectual soirees at which Vespasiano was present and was I think, really a sponge, soaking up all of this knowledge at the feet of Nicolo, this wonderful collector, who then, as I say, introduced him to people like Cosimo de' Medici. Nicolo was a very good friend of Cosimo, and also then to people like Cardinal Cesarini, one of the most powerful cardinals in Rome in the first half of the 1400s, who really became a kind of mentor to Vespasiano. So all of them, I think, recognized that he was an extremely bright young boy, and would be very useful to them, because they could sort of use him to disseminate the wisdom that they were acquiring, and to spread it around Europe. And he sort of repaid their faith in them many times over.
The other thing that Vespasiano had to deal with in his lifetime, aside from wars and invasions and crusades, was the invention of the printing press. And you talk about the history of the Frankfurt Book Fair, which I didn't know was quite that old. That the first time Gutenberg displayed his books was at a Frankfurt Book Fair, what, in 1840? 1440, something like that.
Absolutely, yes. The Frankfurt Fair was one of the biggest in Europe, and it was where books were bought and sold. I could never find that Vespasiano himself went there. I think he probably didn't. I think he believed that he could get what he wanted in Italy, and if he needed something from elsewhere, he had contacts who could get it for him. Many contacts in France, for example, and also places like Hungary and also England. But yes, I mean, the printing press. I mean, for me, the wonderful part of the story, or the strange part of the story, is that Vespasiano reaches the height of his power in the 1450s. He's known as the king of the world's booksellers. Mm-hmm. People, when they get one of his books, write in the flyleaf of it that they purchased it in his shop, because that is an imprint of quality. And they know the resale value is going to be much better because of it. And it's also very prestigious to have one of his books. And it also then makes it very handy for the bibliographers and paleographers who come later, who want to find out which books Vespasiano managed to create. In any case, Vespasiano becomes this famous, coveted book dealer by the 1450s, when Gutenberg, north of the Alps on the banks of the Rhine, invents the printing press. And Vespasiano's career is impacted by it, as inevitably it would be, because suddenly there is now a machine, and then plural machines ultimately across Europe, which can do in the space of a couple of days what it takes his scribes months to do. And they can churn out copies by print runs, for the most part, were about 250 to 300 copies. Some went to 1,000 copies. The City of God, for example, would be done in print runs of 1,000 copies. So obviously this impacted on Vespasiano. However, for two reasons, he was able to keep his head above the water for quite a few decades, longer than we might expect him to, because he did not ever embrace the printing press. He did not sell printed books in his shop, but he was able to continue until 1480 because of the fact that most of his clients did not want printed books. What they wanted were hand-produced ones, which they thought were better quality. In the first place, they were curated by Vespasiano, and secondly, they were beautiful objects. And Vespasiano himself said that no printed book could be as beautiful as the books I produce, which isn't, much as I admire Vespasiano, that's not necessarily true, because a lot of early printed books, including, maybe especially the ones of Gutenberg, are absolutely gorgeous. They're works of art in themselves. But Vespasiano...
Didn't he also invent a font that then the print, once the people with movable type started using it, they copied his font. So it would look as though it was hand done.
Yes, I mean, we can thank Vespasiano for the fact that we have been saved 500 years of eye strain, headache, backache, neckache, etc., because the style of script that he used in his books, in his manuscripts, is the one that printers, when they came to Italy in the 1460s, began using. It's now called Roman type because these German printers set up in Rome, but you should call it Florentine type because it was developed in Florence, not by Vespasiano, but the generation before him, by people like Nicolo Niccoli and also Poggio Bracciolini. The two of them revolutionized the look of a book, and they wanted something much more legible than Gothic. If you look at Gothic script, it's very beautiful, but as Petrarch said, beautiful as it is, it looks as if it were designed for something other than reading. And
it's very difficult to read. Say the Nuremberg Chronicles or something.
Yes. I mean, you just have to look at sort of Roman script next to, or what we call humanist script next to Gothic script to read, and realize how much easier it is to read and also to write, because scribes could produce works more quickly, and speed was of the essence for people like Nicolo and Poggio. They wanted books produced quickly so they could read them and share them with their friends. But then if you think about it, if you set up as a printer in Germany, initially they set up in Germany on the banks of the Rhine, and it wasn't until 1465, fully a decade after Gutenberg showed his Bible at the Frankfurt Book Fair, that printing was done in Italy, because obviously this was a closely guarded secret, the secret of ink, the secret of how to operate the press, how to cast the type, all of these things Gutenberg and also his business partner with whom he fell out, Johannes Fust, the two of them kept this secret, but ultimately the genie came out of the bottle, and a number of workmen who had worked with Gutenberg crossed the Alps, realizing quite rightly that the Italians were the people of the book. If you were going to make money with the printing press, you wouldn't do it in Germany, England, France, anywhere like that. You would do it in Italy. And so that's why
where the literacy rate was higher.
Absolutely. And so that's why these two German guys, Schweinheim and Panarts, Konrad Schweinheim and Arnold Panarts, turn up in Rome and begin printing. But they're printing for the Roman market, for intellectuals in Rome, for people in the Curia, the Roman bureaucracy, for priests, cardinals, people like that. And these people have been reading Vespasiano's manuscripts. And so they're used to the way Vespasiano's scribes work. And so if you're going to make a success of what you're doing, you have to imitate. You have to make the printed book look as much as possible like a handwritten manuscript. That's then why they cut their type to look like the handwriting of Vespasiano's scribes. And that's why when we look at one of Vespasiano's manuscripts today, and I reproduce some in the book, even if you don't know Latin, you can make out every word because of the fact that that is the sort of lettering that the script that we use today.
Mm-hmm. After Vespasiano retired, he started to write his memoirs. And he also wrote a book about how men and women should behave. Now, he did this his handmade way, correct?
That's right. Yeah, very interesting story. He retired from it. I don't want to give away the end of the book to people, but ultimately he decides to close up his bookshop. He uses a very distinguished lawyer in Florence to draw up the contract, a man named Ser Piero da Vinci, who's Leonardo da Vinci's father. Mm-hmm. He resigns from selling the books and becomes a writer himself, writing his memoirs, which is his memories of everyone that he's dealt with, which is a hugely valuable resource for 15th century Florence and 15th century Europe in general, because he gives us all of these anecdotes and stories about the people that he's known. And obviously for me, this was a vital resource for writing the book. But you're absolutely right. He does not commit it to print. And there's a terrible irony in that. He probably made 10 copies of it to give to friends, kind of presentation copies. Here's my memoirs, if you'd like to read them. And most of those disappeared. They were done in the 1480s and 90s. Most disappeared. One was discovered. It had been recopied, and it was discovered in the Vatican Library in the early
Jacob Burckhardt.
That's right. That's right. It electrified Burckhardt, who was this Swiss professor who'd come to Rome in 1847 to do some work in art history, and he discovered Vespasiano's lives of the eminent men of the 15th century. And he was so excited, he forgot about painting and sculpture and concentrated on the intellectual activity of that period. And the result then was Burckhardt's book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, which is and always will be I won't say the best because it's much debated now, but certainly the most influential and arguably important book ever written on the 15th century and 15th century Italy, and because it really invented the concept of the Renaissance. And he invented it. He got all of his knowledge for it and all of his ideas for what happened then from Vespasiano.
Well, we have a bunch of questions now. We have some people who know your work on Brunelleschi's Dome, set in Florence. What do you like so much about Florence? What was the difference between Florence during Brunelleschi's time and Vespasiano's time? Is there another story from Florence you would like to explore? This is all from the same person, Timothy Wachstetter.
Thank you for the questions. I was drawn back to Florence because, as I always am, both literally traveling there, but also intellectually or imaginatively going back in time. The Brunelleschi and Vespasiano overlapped. I could never find out that the two of them knew each other or had met, but I had friends in common, such as Nicolo Nicoli and Poggio Bracciolini. Vespasiano was very good friends with them, and they were very good friends with Brunelleschi. The story I tell, the difference between those two times is maybe just to round off Vespasiano's story. What happens is Vespasiano at the end of his life, when he's writing his memoirs in the 1480s and 90s, looks back at those years in which Brunelleschi featured and in which Cosimo de' Medici featured as the golden age of Florence. And, maybe he's like anyone, as they get older, he looks at his youth and says, those were the good old days. Everything was better back then. And now look at the situation that we're in. On the other hand, he might have had a point. because his vision darkened towards the end of his life. And again, I don't want to give away too much about the book if you're hopefully reading it or plan to buy it. But what happens to Vespasiano is he begins, I think, like all of them, with great optimism. Now that we've got the wisdom of the ancient Romans, we can build a better society. It's a kind of yes, we can moment. And then over the course of the decades, there are terrible, terrible things happen in Florence, including in the street outside his door. I said he had a front row seat in history, and he could sit in his shop window and look out and see brutal executions and things like that. The plague came frequently, and he would flee from the city and everything like that. So he lived through very, very difficult times. And at the end of his life, I think he became disillusioned with what he called human wisdom. And he really said, in many ways, became someone with the same message as Girolamo Savonarola, the friar, the Dominican friar, who in the 1490s really took over Florence. Vespasiano didn't like Savonarola,
No.
but I think he agreed with his ideas in some ways, that there's been too much classical learning and not enough concentrating on the Bible, and that's where we've gone wrong. So I think that's the difference between the two. I guess with Brunelleschi, I just tell a story of, say 16 years in the course of the building of the dome in the 1420s and 30s. This has a larger scope, going from the 1430s, in many ways picking up, you could say, where I left off with Brunelleschi's dome, and then plunging forward many decades through many much more difficult periods in Florentine history.
One of the last questions is, can Mr. King talk about the transition from writing historical fiction to writing award-winning nonfiction?
Yes, well, it seems more natural, but maybe it seemed natural for me at the time. And it didn't strike me as odd at all that I would have moved from fiction writing to nonfiction writing. But I've subsequently discovered in the 25 years or so I've been writing that that's quite unusual. But I think at the time I'd read a lot of Peter Ackroyd, the English novelist and biographer, who will write a novel, and then his book after that is nonfiction, then he'll do a novel, etc. And he very successfully goes back and forth between the two. And so for me, it seemed quite natural. But what I've not done now is I haven't written a novel in over 20 years. My last novel was 1998. So I think I've sort of set out my stall as a nonfiction writer. But the transition for me was very easy. Maybe I could say that I was trained to do nonfiction, because if things had worked out differently, I would have ended up as a professor at a university teaching 18th century literature and history. Things, the way they turned out, though, I began writing novels about 18th century literature and history and 17th century literature and history. And so that was not a huge step for me to write a novel, because I read novels all the time. But I think I feel more comfortable now writing nonfiction because of the fact that maybe I lack the imagination for fiction, or at least I'm thrilled by the truth of the nonfiction. I think I love it when you have a work of nonfiction that is unbelievable. And I hope I have that element of things that are incredible and unbelievable in all of my books, and especially the nonfiction ones.
Well, this last one was as a novel. I was just turning the pages, waiting to get through the story. Part of that last question was, which of your nonfiction books was the most challenging?
Good question. They're challenging for different reasons. And in the case of this, the Bookseller of Florence was challenging in part because it had a much bigger scope. Most of my books, my book on Michelangelo covers about maybe 6 years in the life of Michelangelo and Pope Julius II and Raphael. Brunelleschi's Dome, as I say, covers 16 years. Judgment of Paris covers a dozen years in Paris in the middle of the 19th century. But now suddenly I had a much wider panorama to give of not just a city, but really a culture and an intellectual community. But the difficult thing about writing about Vespasiano compared to other people I've written about, such as Machiavelli, or Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci, is that with those guys, there is a lot of information. In fact, the problem is there is so much information. With Michelangelo, there is so much written about him, no one can or should try to absorb all of it. You have to be extremely selective and look for certain things. And Michelangelo had a very long life, so you can't possibly encompass everything that's been written about him. Vespasiano was the opposite of these guys. Very, very little has been done on him. He is, I think, unjustly neglected over the past 500 years. So one of the things I was faced with doing was truffling up information about him, finding it. And so every nugget, every piece of information I could get about him was absolute, a cause for celebration, because I could bring to light one more thing about him. Whereas with Leonardo da Vinci, there's not a lot new that you can find about him and introduce to people, because so much of it is actually already out there in one form or another.
Well, as I told you earlier, my historian husband and I have been talking about the massive amounts of material you covered and how you brought this all to bear. And as the reviewer said, that Vespasiano was the method more than the subject of your book. And I urge everyone to go out and buy this book. There's also an Audible version of it, which I did both. I listened to and read it. We just have a few more minutes and no more questions. Let me look at the Q&A. No questions left. We've answered all of the questions. Is there anything final you would like to say, Dr. King?
I guess thank you for the invitation, and thank you to my friend Mary Gay Shipley, who is, I believe, involved with the festival and was for many years the bookseller of Arkansas, and with whom I've been to Italy a couple of times. And so I'm very grateful to her for introducing me to this festival and making it possible for me to appear.
Well, I thoroughly enjoyed your book. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you. And next time you're planning to go to Florence, let us know and we'll go.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion with Dr. Ross King, author of The Bookseller of Florence. Thank you. Good afternoon.